I was staying in a cabin on the border of Pennsylvania and Maryland in the mountains. One day, we were snowed in, and when you're snowed up in there, you're stuck, basically. Now, there are plenty of bears and deer up there. We kept salt licks, corn, and all kinds of stuff around. Not to hunt, but just to feed them. Well, I walk by the back window, which is over the underground garage, where we kept the snowmobiles and four-wheelers. I see this big brownish thing in the woods, probably 50 feet from the cabin, just sitting in the snow. I was shocked because I had never really seen a bear there, but heard the stories about them being around. So I ran to get my mom to show her, and as we walked back to the window, the damn thing stood up. And I don't mean like a bear. I mean like a big, tall man standing up. It then turned around and walked with a huge stride and basically took off into the woods. We stood there shocked. What the hell was that? And my uncle just says, "Oh, that's a Squatch. He's a celebrity around here." I don't know if he was just trying to make us feel better by diffusing the situation with a comedic remark, but after that I never went to those woods alone again. That's my encounter. The woods by where my father grew up have an old abandoned house. Well, houses, I should say, scattered throughout the woods. I'm from the Hudson Valley. Anyone from that area knows the woods there have old houses, or at least the foundations remaining. Anyway, when my father was younger, he and everyone else basically would climb up this mountain to an abandoned house. He said it had an old black and white nudes, but a lot of kids would go up to smoke and hang out, so a lot of the things were just smashed. Part of the trip up the mountain basically involved climbing up a cliff, blanking on proper term, just a flat rock surface that you had to scale. This was also his usual way down, so one night he went up alone and was working his way down. Night was settling in, and as he was lowering himself down, the drop-off he felt had an odd presence and glanced upwards towards where he was just standing. Basically, what he saw was a quick glance because whatever it was just made him climb down the mountain and run home. He described it as basically very tall, lumbering above him and covered in hair. It wasn't a bear, at least from the glance he got. Normally, you'd take things to your parents and tell you have some doubt, but after a recent trip to his mother's and her sharing some of his stories that he told, it just made it more believable. There's also that whole you'll see what you want to see, so who knows. I'm terrified of heavily wooded areas, to be honest. I was on a 4-day canoeing trip with friends in a remote part of the southeast United States back when I was a young teen. We were up late, built a bonfire, and goofed off as young boys do. I'm sure we were making a lot of noise. Eventually the fire died down to just coals, and we just sat around it talking when we heard a distant, high-pitched scream. It freaked us out for a little bit, but eventually we forgot about it and went back to talking. A while later, one of my friends pointed to the opposite bank of the river and says, "Guys, what is that?" We looked, and standing there in the trees was a huge silhouette of some figure watching us. It was faint, but it was illuminated by the full moon, and it was huge. We just kind of stared at it in shock for a moment before backing away. We went to get our friend's dad and some flashlights. He was intent on showing us that nothing was there. We got back to the spot and it was still there, so we shined our flashlights on it, but it wasn't enough to get a better look. But the thing's eyes shone red with the reflection of our flashlights. We watched it watching us for a bit, and it walked up along an embankment, and then walked back and disappeared into the woods. That was more than a decade ago, and we rarely talk about it. We were all pretty freaked out. Finally, a chance for me to tell my story. About 10 years ago, my family and I were up in the White Mountains of Arizona to cut down our Christmas tree. My dad was driving our truck with my grandfather in the front seat, and my mom and sister in the back seat. I was in the bed of the truck, along with our family's German short-haired pointer. We were driving along a forest road, and all of a sudden, my dog starts barking and growling. So I look to see what it is, thinking it is maybe a bear or mountain lion. What I saw was a tall, dark figure walking parallel to the road just about 60 to 70 yards away. I yelled at my dad to stop the truck. When I told him I think I see Bigfoot, he just laughed and continued to drive. When I looked back to get another look at it, the figure had changed directions and was walking away from the road. The last thing I saw was the thing's head disappearing down a hill. To this day, I still do not have an explanation for what I saw, and every time the situation comes up, my dad always makes me tell everyone my story just so he could laugh. Didn't see anything, but heard. I lived in rural Massachusetts. To anyone who's familiar, that means miles of woodland with spaced out suburban areas in between. I was walking down my grandfather's logging trail, getting ready for his funeral. I'm also an avid mushroom collector, so I'm always walking slowly and staring at the ground. Friends hate me, basically. So I get to this cool little white-capped mushroom and stop to take a close-up picture of it. And that's when I heard it. The best way I can describe it is as if somebody with a lot of flesh on his knuckles were punching a tree. Now, I know what a deer sounds like when they stomp to protect their children and are smashing their antlers on trees. I've heard bear, fisher cat, moose, pretty much any animal in the western Massachusetts that exists. So, naturally, I looked up and freaked the hell out. It was so rhythmic. Thud, thud, thud. It went on for minutes at the same pace. So, being the curious person that I am, I let out a whistle that couldn't be mistaken for a bird. Right after my whistle, I hear a low, quick whistle back. My first thought is, oh, it must be some asshole logger scooping the land past the no trespassing gate. Ignorant, I know. So I yell out, "Hello?" pretty much as loudly as I could. Then, whatever it was, ran away faster than I've ever heard a human being run. And using my experience with deer, dogs, moose, and bear, I just assessed that I couldn't possibly rationalize it being a four-legged creature. I know that what they sound like running, and this was much closer to a two-legged creature. I'm 100% positive on that. What doesn't make sense, however, is that the two-legged creature that ran away from me, faster than any two-legged creature I have ever heard before, also sounded like it was at a minimum 250 pounds. The steps were loud and very frantic. A lot of people believe Bigfoot has a spiritual connection to the forest it remains in, and thus the creatures in it as well. I do not find it a coincidence that this happened the day of my grandfather's funeral. I ran all the way home, and I have never looked back. Okay, so I have a story that happened to me and my friends. To set the scene, we were on a Boy Scout camping shooting trip. There were 20 to 30 of us. We were in a little cabin thing with windows on the front and back, and a front and back door. There were wooden tables all around the area. The adult cabin was about an eighth of a mile down a gravel road in the dark. There was obviously a buddy system because it's Boy Scouts. So, it's around midnight and everyone had been telling scary stories, just like a normal camping trip. Well, I had to go to the bathroom and asked my friend to come along. He said sure, and he got our knives. We knew that there were bears in the woods, and it made us feel safer. Well, we went to the bathroom and began our walk back. This is where it got scary. I felt an instinctual fear. I looked to my friend, and he had the same look as me. We began to walk just a little bit faster and unfold our pocket knives. I then turn around and see it. It looked similar to a cat, but it was roughly 6 feet tall and was on its hind legs, kinda hunched over. I freaked the hell out and started running. My friend sees it too, and we sprint back to the cabin. It began making a moaning, howling noise and followed us very closely. We pound on the door, and the guys let us in. We tell them what we saw, and they actually believed us. So we locked the front door and looked at the back door. It had no lock. We pushed a table up against it and had a kid there with his knife for safety. We draw the blinds on all the windows that had them. One of them didn't, and we sat there with all the lights on. Then we see the eyes outside of the windows without blinds. We are all shitting ourselves, and the thing slowly walked to the back door. We heard it bumping up against it, maybe trying to open it, we think. It then left, but we still thought we were going to die. No one slept that night. And when the adults came to wake us up, we told them, and they just laughed and said we were making it up. We know it happened, even if they didn't believe us. Not me, but my cousin. In the 80s, my cousin was on a camping trip with his wife. It wasn't a busy day for camping, and according to my cousin, the ranger told them that they were the only ones camping there that night. Anyway, so it's getting late, and my cousin said he spots something across the lake. He thought it was a bear standing, so he grabs his binoculars. It was sort of like a bear, but it was standing up on its hind legs. He said it wasn't a bear because it had a face, like a 70-year-old man, and the fur was longer than a bear. He thought maybe it was someone in a suit, but it disappeared quickly, whatever it was. He was so spooked and wanted to leave the park immediately. His wife thought he was being ridiculous, though, and just having an overactive imagination. She had brought a shotgun and insisted that they be fined if anything happened. Anyway, so that night everything is going fine until my cousin is awakened by footsteps. Now, his wife is still asleep at this point, but he doesn't want to wake her. He just tries to keep as still and quiet as possible. A figure approaches the tent. My cousin said he was positioned so that his head was on the corner of the tent. This figure leans down and gently presses its hand around the corner of the tent. So the figure is basically putting its hands around my cousin's head. I don't remember how long he said this lasted, but this figure eventually left. My cousin said it smelled like mechanical things, like someone working on a car, although he heard no car. Next morning, everything at the campsite was untouched. No problems at all. My cousin didn't mention anything about finding footprints. There wasn't any evidence that someone had been there. He eventually went and researched the area and discovered that their camping area is supposedly a hot spot for Bigfoots and such. He firmly believes that he saw some kind of Sasquatch. I'm not sure if I believe him. If anything, I always thought it was just a person messing with him. I actually have several other stories, but I didn't want to post to drag on, and I thought it would be too overwhelming. What convinced me was I saw it happen, and my cousin saw it with me. We were cruising through some rural areas in my cousin's car, and I want to say it was about 1 or 2 a.m. We weren't smoking or drinking, but just having a nice cruise. We went on this road that went through some heavy woods, but we did it before, so we had no fear. It was dark, of course, no moon, with just a slight sprinkle of rain. We were coming to this part in the woods where there was a street light, but it was an old light and was starting to dim out. There used to be an old building there, but was torn down, but the light stayed up for a few years. Mind you, this was very rural, and no one lived nearby for maybe 20 miles, so it was extremely rare for you to pass another car, let alone another person at this time. It didn't help that the locals said, stay out of the woods at night. I was just looking out my window at the woods, and when we were coming up to the light, next thing I know, the car does a movie turn, like stomp on the brakes, do a 180, and freaking burn rubber the other way. I get weirded out and look back through the car, and I see the road illuminated by the streetlight, and I see this massive black figure beside the road. It takes one step, and it's in the middle of the road. Another step, and it's already on the other side. Immediately, I look forward, scared out of my mind, and look at my cousin, and I see the intense fear on his face. We don't say a word to each other, and he drops me off. I stay up till sunrise and finally go to sleep. Funny now that I think about it, we never talked about once, not after it happened, but yeah, we saw Bigfoot, and the locals do tell very similar stories. Last October, I was in California for roughly 11 days after my brother's wedding in San Diego. I just wanted to drive around the state and visit California places that had captured my imagination over the years, and I love driving almost as much as I love cars. I don't necessarily believe in Sasquatch, but I would never discount someone else's experience, especially if I wasn't there, so off I went. Clipper Mills is in the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas, about 70 miles northeast of Sacramento. Very near that dam was in the danger of failing last year. Pretty remote. So, after Bodega Bay, I head across the state for my destination, arriving near Sacramento in time for a late dinner. So it's after dark when I set out on the final leg. Very dark. It takes me a good while on all the twisty turning roads to find my way there. I wanted to get to the exact spot the person who posted the video parked that night. He wouldn't say in his video, so I poked around YouTube comment sections and related videos and found out more or less about the spot. Around 11 p.m., I pulled my rented Camry well off the dark 2-lane road to avoid any issues with the very sparse traffic. I saw no one whatsoever, so I sat in the darkened interior, listening, allowing my eyes to dark adapt for about 20 minutes. I heard nothing but assorted insects as I sat there. Saw nothing move at all. Eventually, not wanting to activate the car's interior lighting, I crawled out of the driver's side window into the black night, armed with my cell, with no service, a handheld GPS to find my way back should I get lost in the dark, and a red flashlight I use with my telescope. I stand there right by that car window for a solid 2 minutes before I could screw up the courage to move away from my Camry. Eventually, I walk up the road, still not hearing anything but bugs. Suddenly, without conscious decision to do so, I veer right and head up into the woods. My feet are crunching pine needles now, and to my mind, I sound like Bigfoot stomping around myself. After what was about 20 minutes, I stopped to listen and added to the insects I hear this faint screeching sound far off in the blackness. And it doesn't sound insect-like at all. It has more consciousness to it. The now also thoroughly dark adapted mind is whispering that it sounds like a person in distress, or a large primate. I remain still. I hear something small scurrying around in the underbrush as well, followed a minute later by that same forlorn-sounding wail, but now closer. Time to return to the car. As I'm walking back to the car, I hear this spooky sound, every 20 to 30 seconds, and now it is coming from behind me and in front of me. Shit. It seems to have a vocabulary of some sort to me now. Different vocalizations, some guttural, some high-pitched, and everywhere in between. My mind is having fun, just messing with me now. I was never so happy to see a Camry in all my life. I started it up before my ass was in the seat, I think, and half expected to see scores of red eyeballs glowing at me in the headlights from the dark forest in front of me. Now spooked, and my mind telling me some homicidal axe-wielding lunatic was nipping at my heels. I went back the way I came at much quicker pace than I had arrived. Out of nowhere, right in front of me, this black lab runs out of the woods on one side of the road and into the woods on the other. I barely missed crushing him. That scared the shit out of me right there. I slowed down a bit, and the thought of nearly mowing down an innocent mutt overcoming my mind. Some hour down the road towards Sacramento is when I noticed I had cell service again. I opened my Expedia app and found a nearby hotel for the night. Once safely enclosed in said hotel room, I began scouring the internet on my iPad and came to the conclusion that what I heard was a barred owl or a western screech owl. Can never be 100% sure, I suppose. Very creepy though, and I'm done with wandering alone in the woods at night, I think.